Now, and welcome everyone to week 2 of English composition. This is the week that we're going to be taking all of that wonderful research that you did last week and transforming it into a fantastic, best possible first version that you can create of your perseverance essay. So the lecture today is going to talk about that process of taking that research and integrating it with your own ideas to create your essay. It's going to talk about how to take all that source data you collected last week and transform it into proper citations, proper credit for your sources, and we're also going to look at essay structure and those sorts of things. So we do have a lot to cover today. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask, since there is so much being covered today, and since it is fairly complex material, that you save your questions for those times when I ask if anyone has any questions. That way you're not missing something while there's conversation going on in the chat. There will be opportunities to ask questions during the lecture and at the end of the lecture as usual. And then if you have any questions later, if you're viewing this lecture later, if you're watching the recording, either rewatching it or watching it for the first time because you weren't able to make it to the live session, do keep in mind that you can contact your instructor after watching the lecture if you have any questions about what was covered in the lecture. We're always happy to talk to those students who are watching the recorded lectures and answer any questions that they have. So we're going to get started here. You'll require that we discussed the writing process last week, and we talked about how the creative process requires perseverance to produce a polished final product. Last week you spent time doing research and generating ideas, gathering the information that you needed. Basically, the first two steps in this writing process, the brainstorming and the researching and investigating, this week you're going to communicate those ideas to an audience as effectively as you can. So what you create this week will be the best version that you can make now. It's not going to be perfect. No version is ever going to be perfect, and you will find ways to improve on this writing as we work through the later stages of the process this month. In week 3, as we do feedback, and in week 4, as we revise, you're going to learn ways to improve on the strengths of your current writing. But the idea this week is to do your absolute best that you can do now so that when you're getting the feedback next week, you are improving on your best instead of hearing feedback about you already know how to fix. Learning how to fix things you already know how to fix is not helping you become stronger writers. So that's where we're at this week. I mentioned audience, the best possible writing for your audience. When we talk about audience in regard to a piece of writing, what we are referring to is your readers, or sometimes if it's a piece of writing that you're going to record later or present live, it may be your listeners or your viewers. But your audience is the people who are on the receiving end of what you've written. They're the people you're trying to communicate with through your writing. For this particular assignment, you have an option of 3 possible audiences. These are on the assignment sheet, so you can refer to that later if you have questions or you want to refresh your memory of what the options are. But the options are all relevant audiences for this assignment. Your first option is potential employers, and I don't mean pick one specific employer. I mean anyone who you could potentially work for. I want you to speak in general to all of those people who could potentially be the bosses that you'll have in your future career, which means you need to think about how you would, in your writing, present yourself professionally to an audience of potential employers. That's your first possible audience. Your second possible audience would be industry connections. Again, this is a professional audience, but it's somewhat different from potential employers because these are more likely to be people on your peer level or maybe slightly above your peer level who you want to network with, who you want to make connections with. People who you'd like to share ideas with and learn about new opportunities in your industry. So again, this is a professional audience you're going to collaborate with possibly also. So you're going to want to think about how you would present yourself, again, professionally in writing, thinking about tone and such, your word choice, the things you have to say to your readers. But you want to think about them in terms of potential people that you would collaborate with, or that you could use to make connections in your industry. The third possible audience for your assignment this month is your family. And in this case, you might want to think about, how would you communicate differently with your family from the way you would with a professional audience. For instance, with a professional audience, you're going to want to use a somewhat more formal tone. With your family, you can probably be a little more casual, but you still want to communicate with them clearly and effectively. You also need to keep in mind the things that your readers already know. You want to. You may be sarcastic with your family. Jordan says, with my family, I'm sarcastic. You may be sarcastic with your family. Please don't be sarcastic in your writing assignments. There can be a little bit of humor, but you don't want to be that informal, because the other idea behind this assignment is to practice your best possible writing so that you are developing skills that you'll use later on here at Full Sail and in your career. So not too casual. Okay, the reason audience is important is because these are things you need to consider when you are writing. There are certain questions you have to ask when you're writing to make sure that you're conveying information effectively to your readers. You have information that you need to convey. You have ideas that you need to share. And we'll get into some of that in a little more detail later on in this session. But those ideas that you need to share need to be shared effectively with the people who are reading them. I'm seeing something coming up in chat here, a comment about the audio, but I'm not sure what's going on because I've only seen one message. So I think I'm only seeing half the message here. If there is trouble with the audio on this recording, I'll end up posting the lecture from last month, so which is the same. Okay, that's good to hear. I'm seeing reports back from people that they're hearing everything fine. So we're going to just keep going. So when you're writing, you need to think about who your readers are going to be. You need to think about what information you need to give them in order for them to understand what you're trying to say. So questions that might come to mind when you are writing might be, what do my readers already know? Because you don't want to define things for your readers that they already know or explain things that they already know. If you do that, they might feel condescended to. And you definitely don't want your readers to get the impression that you're being condescending. That's not a great way to make them want to continue reading. Another question you might ask when dealing with audience is, why should they care? Okay, now, and you may remember some of this stuff from creative presentation. In creative presentation, you learned to connect with your audience by choosing examples and details and stories that would resonate with them, those star moments. And the same thing applies to writing essays. Your audience, your readers, they are still king. They're still, the people that you have to connect with. So you need to think about what you know about them. How can you connect with them? What details will resonate with them? What do you want them to do or think or feel because of reading your essay? And these are the questions that will help you make those connections. Why should they care what you have to say? This isn't something that you're necessarily going to include in the essay. You should care about this but you need to understand why they care so that you can communicate your ideas clearly. What biases might they have about your topic? Keep in mind that bias doesn't necessarily mean a prejudice against something. It can also mean a prejudice for something. Do they already really care about what you're doing, or do they already, maybe not care? And how can you influence that? Let's see, what will they learn by reading your essay? What new information can you deliver to them? And also, what do you hope they will do or think or feel after reading your essay? These are all important questions to consider. So I've used the word essay here a lot in just these first few minutes of the lecture. So what is an essay? Anyone want to take a chance at defining that? Take a shot at guessing what we mean when we say essay. Abia says a paper. Yes, essentially. Can we get a little more specific? A research paper. Okay, essays do frequently involve research, but they don't always have to involve research. Rachel says, a written piece, formal or informal, that communicates the writer's idea about a topic. Yes. Kevin says, a nonfiction paper. Yes. We're all on the right track here. There's one key element that we're missing from this description. Haley says, a narrative about a focused subject of discussion. Marissa says, a short piece of writing on a particular subject. Absolutely. A short piece of writing, nonfiction writing, on a particular subject. So it's not something extremely long. It is nonfiction, which means it's true and factual, and it has a very focused and specific topic. So the important thing to remember is that an essay can be a lot of different things. If, you know, using this as our loose general definition of essay, this means that an essay could be a pamphlet that you hand out. You know, depending on how the content is developed in that pamphlet. It could be delivered via a slideshow. It could be written up as an article. It could be presented as a letter. There are a lot of different formats, like end formats, that an essay can take. But what it's important to know is that essay structure, basic essay structure, is the foundation for good content and strong communication. So we're going to take a look at what that structure is. Okay? So once you know the key elements that matter to your audience, once you've figured out who your audience is, and you know, essentially like what level you have to communicate with them on, you have to find a good structure for presenting those elements. So basic essay structure involves 3 parts. You must have an introduction with a thesis and a main idea. You have to have support, and you have to have a conclusion. So if you think back to our discussion of paragraphing last week, it's very similar. You have, in the beginning, something that identifies what your topic is going to be for your readers. And then in the middle, you have all the development for that topic. And then at the end, you wrap it back to that introduction. You make sure everything is a nice, complete package. Screen. All right, so we're going to take a look at essay structure in a little more detail here. But it's important for you to remember that strong essays and strong paragraphs are structured very similarly. We're also going to talk about organizational tools for creating a good essay. So we'll talk about organization here in a few more minutes. But it's important to know that organization is an important step that you need to apply before you write your essay, and that there are a lot of different approaches that organization can take. So we'll talk about that more in a few minutes here. I want to go a little bit deeper into essay structure first. So with an essay, you start with an introduction. For a very short essay, this is typically going to be one relatively brief paragraph. If you're writing a very long essay, say a 10-page essay or more, then your introduction may be a couple of paragraphs. But the purpose of an introduction is just to grab your reader's attention and identify your topic. So your introduction is going to start with a hook, which is an opening statement that is intended to grab readers' attention and make them want to read more. And then that opening paragraph, that introduction, is going to end with your thesis statement, which is the main idea or major claim that the body of the essay is going to develop and support. And you should keep this paragraph short. It doesn't need to be a big, chunky paragraph. You know, the development is all going to happen in the body of your essay. The introduction just needs to grab readers and tell them what your topic is going to be. That's essentially its purpose. So once you've grabbed your reader's attention, once you've presented your thesis, then you need to develop the essay. And that's what the body of the essay does. This is where all of the heavy lifting happens in your essay. You need to develop and support the main idea, including any thoughts that you have about the topic or any conclusions that you have come to based on your research. And you're going to use research sources when relevant to provide support or alternate points of view where relevant, depending on the essay's purpose. You know, sometimes it helps to provide an opposing point of view. Sometimes you need more information to support a claim that you're making in the body of your essay. This is where all of your research gets used. You shouldn't have research in the introduction. You'll note if you look at the, block up at the top for introduction, it does not include the word research anywhere. That's because it doesn't belong there. That belongs in the body of your essay. And when you're working on the body of your essay, you should also keep in mind that there will be one main idea per paragraph. And each of those main ideas that those paragraphs develop needs to support your overall thesis for the paper. So after you've developed the body of your essay, you'll need to conclude your essay. And again, the conclusion is going to be brief. It doesn't need to be long and drawn out. This paragraph is intended to wrap up your essay. Think of it like putting a bow on a Christmas present or landing the plane after a journey. You know, the introduction you take off, the journey you travel, the conclusion you land, okay? You want to transition into the conclusion by reminding readers about the main idea or major claim of your essay, but this is not a flat restatement of your thesis. This should be something more nuanced and subtle. You know, remind them what that main idea is, but don't just repeat it in the same words. And then you want to set your readers down gently with a final closing statement that sort of sums up your previously developed conclusions or poses thoughts for the future. And again, you want to keep this paragraph short. You don't want to get into heavy repetition of the things you've already said in the body of your essay. Your readers don't need you to repeat that. It's a short essay. Their memories are not that brief. But you need to wrap everything up neatly. And you want to also avoid bringing in any new ideas or information in the conclusion. All development and support belongs in the body of the essay. All right? Don't provide any research or ideas in the conclusion, because the conclusion is for concluding. It's not for developing. So your essay is going to have a very specific focus, and I'm going to take a moment here to jump out of the lecture and pull up the assignment instructions just so that we can take a closer look at those. So we've already talked about your audience for this assignment, and as I mentioned, those potential audiences are here on page 3 of the instructions. There's also some possible writing objectives that you may consider when you are communicating with these audiences. For instance, you may decide that your purpose for writing this essay is to show readers that you've studied the problem-solving methods of someone in your industry and you've considered how you can use that knowledge to persevere on the job when the going gets tough. Or show that you're taking steps to become the kind of person who would be excellent to work with by learning methods to overcome problems that may arise in your career. Or show that you've considered the pitfalls of this industry and that you have a plan in place for resolving any problems you may encounter. These are kind of the objectives you may want to keep in mind as you are meeting these assignment requirements. So basic assignment requirements, this is going to be a narrative and informative essay. It's going to be a blend of these two styles. It's going to be narrative because you're going to be relaying essentially stories about how your role models have solved problems. You're also going to be narrating your own thoughts and reactions to what you've learned and your own ideas about how you can apply that to your own future career. And you're also going to be informing readers about what you've learned. So this is a blend of those two writing styles. And you'll find that in writing, it's never strictly one style. You usually have a blend of styles. Jordan, I see you have a question, so hold that just a moment. Let me finish going over the instructions here real quick, and then we'll address your question. Okay, so as you're writing this essay, it needs to achieve three things. You're going to write about that one work-related problem your role model encountered and the three methods used to solve it, those things you researched last week, or, the three problems and the method used to solve each problem. If you stop there, you're not done. That's 1/3 of your essay. After you've developed this, you also need to write about what you learned from your role model about problems you may encounter and their possible solutions. So this is where you start applying the critical thinking about what you've learned. This is where the critical thinking you did when you were writing your reaction paragraphs last week is going to become very useful for developing this part of your essay. So hopefully you followed the model that I gave you last week for those reaction paragraphs, because that's the information you're going to need. And then the third thing that your essay needs to do, all of this in the body of the essay, is provide information about how you think you can use the problem-solving methods you learned in order to persevere in your degree program and industry. So again, more critical thinking, this time thinking forward. Like, I learned this, and now I think I may be able to apply this information in this way. And you can even expand on this by writing about the things you can do now in order to prepare ahead of time to be able to apply those problem-solving methods effectively. So you should think of this essay as an opportunity to set goals for progressing toward your career. It can also serve as a sort of reminder to yourself as you are working through your other classes of the fact that you have anticipated problems and you are preparing solutions. So we've talked a bit about audience. I do want to cover one more important aspect of the assignment instructions here. This essay will be at least 700 words. That's the bare minimum. If it's not at least 700 words, it's not long enough. Keep writing. And it will be no more than 1,400 words. Now, if you go over 1,400 words, you need to cut back and work on making it more concise. Now, these do not include the cover page and the references list. This is just the essay itself. It must include research from all three of your sources, and it will be in APA style, and I'll talk about that more later on during the lecture. It will have a cover page and a references page. It will not have an abstract. Okay. So what was your question, Jordan? Okay, Jordan's saying that when he was researching his role model, the only problem he saw that his role model encountered was accusations of plagiarism, but he wasn't able to find out how he solved those accusations, and that he didn't see any other problems that his role model encountered. In that case, you may have to consider using a different role model. And that was something I talked about during last week's lecture, is if you can't find the information you need about the first role model that you've chosen, then you need to choose a different role model. So if you found yourself stuck and not able to find the information you needed about the first person that you selected, then you may need to do additional research this week or research someone else. I talked about that for a couple of minutes, so but that was something I definitely emphasized quite a bit. Avia, what's your question? That's the reason we do research in week one, is so that you have plenty of opportunities to figure out who you're going to write about before you have to start using the information. Avia's asking, if you didn't, I'm just going to paraphrase here, if you didn't do great on the first project, how do you use that information for your essay? I'm going to talk about that in more detail here later on in the lecture, but basically you're going to be getting feedback from your instructor this week. If you're in my class, you'll be getting feedback from me. If you're in Professor Chapman's class, you'll get feedback from Professor Chapman, and so on. So you're going to get feedback from your instructor this week. If your instructor says, hey, one of these sources was not great, then between now and when you turn in your essay, you have to find a better source to replace it with. If your instructor says, hey, you needed to develop this information more effectively when you were, analyzing your sources, then that's something that you're going to have to work on doing as you are writing the essay. Keep in mind the research and reactions we did last week were a lot of essentially pre-writing. So if you didn't do so great on the pre-writing, if you haven't prepared as well for the writing this week, then you're going to have to, spend a little more time on that pre-writing this week in order to get caught up to where you need to be. Haley's asking, do you have to use the same 3 sources you used in the discussions? Unless your instructor says, these are not great sources. If you get feedback saying these are not great sources, you need to find better sources, then you should find better sources. But if you get feedback on the sources you already chose and those sources are fine, then those are the sources you need to use. Christian is asking about changing his role model from the first assignment. Contact your instructor and ask about that first and explain your reasons for why you want to change your role model. And have a conversation directly with your instructor, a one-on-one conversation, and go over with your reasons for wanting to make that change and get approval from your instructor at that point. That's my recommendation. If you were able to find nothing about the role model you chose last week, then you're probably going to have to change your role model. And that's something you definitely want to let your instructor know. So another important thing to remember when you are writing this essay is that you're going to write for your audience. You're going to write with the assumption that one of these 3 groups is going to be your group of readers. But I don't want you to write as if you're talking to your audience. Don't talk to your audience, because this is not a letter, this is not a speech, this is not a phone conversation. Okay, so think about the kind of readers who will be reading your work, and keep in mind how that influences whether you need to use formal, semi-formal, or informal language, whether you need to define industry terms. Obviously, if your audience is potential future employers or industry connections, they know what those terms mean. They don't need them defined. If you're writing for your family might need those terms defined. So these are things that you'll need to keep in mind as you are considering your audience for your essay. So let's see, we're going to jump back into the lecture here. So as I mentioned, your focus for this essay is not a biography of your role model. If all I see is a bunch of biographical information with no critical thinking about what you've learned or how you can apply it, then again, that's 1/3 of your essay. It's incomplete, and it's not going to get the kind of grade that you're hoping for. So your focus needs to include what you discovered about how your role model persevered, how your role model solved problems, what you learned about perseverance or problem solving from your role model's example, and how you plan to apply what you learned. And you want to keep this fairly balanced, okay? So it's going to be approximately 1/3 each. If 3/4 of your essay is just about describing how your role model solved problems, and you try to clump this last 2/3 into one dinky little paragraph, that means that a significant portion of what you're supposed to be writing about is underdeveloped. And that's something that's probably the first thing your instructor is going to note in his or her feedback is you need to develop this part more. Okay, so you want to keep the development fairly well balanced. So I mentioned organization earlier. I said organization is something we're going to talk about. There are several ways to approach organization in your writing. Most of you are probably familiar with the process of writing formal outlines from junior high and high school. How many of you have never had to write a formal outline in your life? I'm actually seeing a handful of people saying they've never had to write formal outlines. APA is different from formal outlines, Haley. Formal outline is, where you've got the Roman numerals and the letters, and you've got like 1 and A and then 1, and you break things down. So there are a few of you who've never written formal outlines. Okay, most of you probably have. I know that's something that's kind of drilled into everyone's head. So, but a formal outline is not the only way to approach organizing your ideas. And if you've used formal outlines in the past and you've found that that really kind of bogs you down when you're writing, there are alternatives. There are also thumbnail outlines, which are very brief. You just sort of jot down in a list the main ideas that you're going to cover in your writing, and think about the order that you're going to cover them in. Maybe change the order up a little bit, draw a few arrows, move things around, whatever. But it's much less formal, and it's a sort of quick reference that you can look at. Like, okay, I know I want to discuss these specific things. It's like, I'm going to discuss problem A and solution A and how I think I can use that, and then problem B, and so on. Thumbnail outlines are great if you already have a pretty strong sense of what you want to say, and you already have a fairly clear sense of what order you want to put that in. Formal outlines are better if you're still trying to kind of figure out all the details. They can sort of push you to do that critical thinking in a little more depth before you write. But some people may already off the top of their head have like words and whole paragraphs, whole sentences, and they want to get them down on the page before they're gone out of their heads. And in that case, you can use a sort of backwards approach to writing, where you scribble down essentially a free write or a very rough draft just to get all of those ideas out of your head and on the page. And then you go back with a highlighter marker and use that to go through your writing line by line and figure out where you've got your ideas scrambled together. It's like, okay, I know I have like 3 or 4 main ideas in here, so I'm going to assign a different color to each idea. I'm going to go through sentence by sentence and see which idea that sentence relates to, and then it's like, oh gosh, I'm looking at this and it's all colorful, and I realize I've got the orange and the blue all mixed together. So I need to separate those. And that can help you sort of organize after the fact. So that's a great way to get all that information out of your head and onto the page where you can organize it more visually. If you're a very visual learner, this highlighter technique, using like either highlighter markers on a printout of your essay or a printout of your rough notes, or using the highlighter tool in Microsoft Word, can be very helpful to help you, visualize that structure more effectively than words on a page. What I'd like you all to do as you are working on organizing your essays is try a couple of different strategies. Don't force yourself into that formal outline right off the bat if you're feeling like you are ready to start writing. But if you aren't sure where to begin, maybe try the formal outline to see if that helps you develop a stronger sense of what you're going to say and what order you're going to say it in. Try that thumbnail outline. Try the highlighter method. Even if you do a formal outline or a thumbnail outline and then you get your writing done, go back in with the highlighters and see if that can help you improve your organization. Because what you're going to find over time, and this is true of every writer, is that there are different organizational strategies that work for each writer, but there are also different organizational strategies that work for each writing situation. I can tell you, from my own personal experience, when I'm developing something that's extraordinarily long and complex, like a 20-page essay, I tend toward more formal outlines or something midway between a thumbnail outline and a formal outline, because that way I can really develop that structure before I start writing. But if I'm writing a very brief, like 1 or 2-page essay, I will do a thumbnail outline, because that's really all I need to keep all that information together. Sometimes, if I'm feeling really inspired, I'll use the highlighter technique. Because, I've got those ideas, I want to get them on the page, and then I want to move them around. Teddy's saying he uses Post-it notes so he can flip around topics to see what's the best flow, and that's also a great suggestion. I've also heard of writers typing up their rough notes and then cutting up the paragraphs and moving the pieces of paper around. So there are lots of different ways to begin thinking about how you want your ideas to flow before you begin putting them on the page, and even to refine that flow after you have them on the page. And I want you to try a couple of different organizational techniques as you're working on this essay so that you can get a better sense of what works for you, and also so that you can work on strengthening organization as a habit in your writing process, okay? And keep in mind that what works best for you on this essay may not be what works best for you on the next writing assignment that you have. Because again, a lot of that depends on how confident you're feeling about your ideas before you begin to put words on the page. Okay? So those are some important things to keep in mind. I don't require, formal outlines for every writing assignment. I don't think that is the best way for every writer to work for every writing project. And you will find the process that works best for you. So that's just a little bit about organizational strategies, but now I want to talk about the specific ideas that this essay has to cover and a couple of possible ways that you could organize those ideas. And this is, in general, what we call a point-to-point organization, or there's a term for it, and I'm completely forgetting the term right now. But your organizational strategy can take a couple of different approaches. So keep in mind that this essay has to examine the specific ways that your role model has solved a problem or problems. It also has to evaluate what you learned from those problem-solving examples, and it has to explain how you can use what you've learned to achieve your own career goals. So one organizational strategy you might take is to discuss all of those problems and solutions first, then discuss all the things that you learned, then discuss how you can use that in the future and how you can prepare now in order to use that in the future. Depending on how much information you have to develop, this may be one or two, maybe 3 paragraphs, and then 1, 2, 3 paragraphs, 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. It really depends on how much you have to say. This will also work very well if you have one problem with 3 solutions for that problem. This is probably going to be the strongest way to organize your essay. However, this is not the only way to organize your essay. You could easily examine one specific way that your role model solved a problem, evaluate what you've learned from that method, and explain how you can use the method in the future, and then repeat that for each additional problem that your role model solved. So again, how you structure your essay is going to depend in part on the information you were able to find, and in part also on what you've learned. Albeit this may be the best format for 3 different problems. However, suppose you discovered 3 different problems that your role model solved and 3 different solutions, but you learned one major lesson from all 3 of those things. You might want to talk about all 3 problems and all 3 solutions first, and then talk about the one major takeaway that you learned from those 3 problems and 3 solutions. Maybe they were similar problems, or maybe the solutions had something in common. It's, again, how you organize your essay is going to depend on the information that you were able to find and the best way of communicating that to your readers. So these are just possibilities. But you're going to have to do some critical thinking to figure out what's going to work best for your topic. So, as I mentioned previously, you're going to use research for support in this essay. This is not merely a report on what you've read, it's a critical thinking essay. You did the research to learn something, this essay is about what you've learned, but you also have to include the research in the essay to demonstrate, how you learned that knowledge. So, you've learned that type of problem A can be solved with solution approach B, and you learned that from reading about problems X, Y, and Z that your role model solved. So you're going to use research as support. Research, when used effectively, it strengthens your ideas. It should never replace your ideas. Okay, I don't want you to play parrot. This is not a game of, this is what everybody else said. This is a situation where you need to learn how to blend things you've learned from other people with your own thoughts. And this is where that critical thinking comes in. So there's a strategy for melding research with your own ideas that we here in the English department like to refer to as the quote sandwich. And by the time I get to the end of this portion of the lecture, you're all probably going to be a little bit hungry. Okay, so the quote sandwich involves sandwiching your research in between your own ideas to use the research effectively for support. In the quote sandwich, you start with basically your top slice of toast. This is your main point. Key words, your main point. The point that you, the essay writer, are trying to develop. It's your idea. It may be an argument or an explanation or a fact. The research you integrate into this paragraph is going to be used to support your idea or provide validity to your idea. Okay, so in this case, the point we're trying to develop is that a BLT is extremely hard to resist because humans are chemically drawn to bacon. We'll see if the research supports this argument. So after you have identified the point you're trying to make, you need to introduce the research. So this is basically the tomato of your BLT. All right, the tomato introduces the author of the quotation or the paraphrase or the summary. The slides here specifically say quote, but you can use this same method to introduce a paraphrase of something that you learned from research, which, as you'll recall from last week, when you paraphrase, you take something you learned from research and put it into your own words. Or you can use this method to introduce a summary of something that you learned from research. And of course, summary is when you take what you learned and you condense it and put it in your own words. So this same method works whether you're quoting directly or whether you are just putting those ideas into your writing. You still need to give credit to the source of those ideas, regardless of whether you're using their words or your own words to deliver that information. So we introduce the research. We identify the source. Who does this information come from? You don't want your readers guessing at the origin of this quote. You don't want it to just pop up out of nowhere like a pothole in the road. That's very distracting for your readers. And it kind of derails their reading process. I mean, if you're going along nice and smooth down the highway and then, your tire goes in a giant hole in the road because somebody forgot to pave that over with a nice introduction of the source, you're going to sort of lose your train of thought. To mix a lot of metaphors here. So it's a metaphor sandwich. So anyway, you want to introduce the source of your quotation. And in this case, the source of this information is Ellen Roberts. Well, who the heck is Ellen Roberts, and why do we care what Ellen Roberts has to say? This is where the lettuce comes in. This is the authority. This is how we know that Ellen is someone we can trust. We need to know our source's credentials. Show that we're citing a seasoned expert in the field. So Ellen Roberts is the head of public engagement at the Center for Life in Newcastle. So now we know that she's someone who works at what is potentially a medical facility. I want to maybe dig a little bit further into what the Center for Life is before I necessarily trusted her credentials, but we have the sense that she's someone who has some credentials. Okay. So from here, we need to provide the quote or the summary or the paraphrase. This is the meat, the good stuff, the author's exact words or the author's exact ideas. You want to make sure that it's relevant to your point and it lends credence to your idea. You want like the gourmet bacon, and you don't want the fatty, nasty, cheap bacon. You want the good stuff, which means when you're pulling those quotes, if you decide to use an exact quote and copy an author's exact words, get just the words that are most relevant, okay? Just that snippet that is the most relevant. You don't need all the surrounding information. You don't necessarily need all of the context, as long as you're not taking the quote completely out of context and implying that the author was saying something they didn't mean. Just get the meat of the quote, the important part, or the tofu of the quote if you happen to be vegetarian, tofu bacon. Okay, so this is the heavy-duty part. This is where the research is actually coming in, and in this case, the smell of sizzling bacon in a pan is enough to tempt even the staunchest of vegetarians. There's something deeper going on inside. It's not just the idea of a tasty snack. There's some complex chemistry going on. Okay. So we've got the quote in here, but since we're using exact words in this case, we need to make sure that readers know that we have copied exact words from our source. If we were paraphrasing, it would be in our own words, but in this case, we're not. So we need the quotation marks, the mayonnaise, to show that these are exact words, and to show where those exact words begin and end. We're still not done, though. We've provided the source of our information. We've given this person's credentials. We have identified what this person had to say. Now we need to provide the significance. We need to tie this research back to our own ideas, because remember, it's a quote sandwich, right? It's all about making sure that that research is supporting our ideas and not just, taking over our paper. So the bottom slice of toast is where we connect things back to our own ideas. Explain the significance. Show how this research supports what you're trying to say. In this case, we wrap it up by saying bacon's appeal is not just in the taste buds. The scent actually penetrates the brain with a chemical message that screams, "I'm yummy." Are we done? No, we're still not done, okay? Because we can't just serve this sandwich on our bare hands. That's messy. So we need the napkin to clean it up. This is where the citation comes in. This is how we indicate that the quote comes from a source, not from ourselves. So in this case, the citation goes in at the end of the sentence. And you'll see in this particular example, go back a slide here. You'll see in this particular example that we're saying that Ellen Roberts was quoted in Jameson 2009, paragraph 6. This is a slightly unusual method of in-text citation. In this case, Ellen Roberts was being quoted by another author who we are now quoting. This is what we refer to as a secondary source. That's probably not the best source. If Ellen Roberts was our primary source, then we would not use this as quoted in phrasing, because Roberts would be the person we were quoting. So it would be Roberts 2009, paragraph 6. Just to keep that in mind. And there's plenty of information about how to do in-text citations in the APA Basics handout that is attached with Assignment 2 that shows you how to break that down. So, and we'll talk about that also some more later on in the lecture today in more detail. So you'll have plenty of opportunities to learn how to do in-text citations correctly. Just know that this is a slightly unusual type of citation here. And then, of course, once you have provided your in-text citation, that's still not enough, because the in-text citation flags the research, and it shows that this information came from a source, but it doesn't provide enough information for our readers to find that source later. So we also need, on a page at the end of our essay, a list of references. And this is where the detailed information about your source goes, is in that list of references to show what the source of this quotation is. So when you're integrating research, remember the quote sandwich. Remember that you need to cite that quote to make sure that readers know that that information came from someone else, or cite that paraphrase or summary to make sure that readers know that information came from someone else. And also make sure that you have a reference page that has all the detailed information about your sources. So, 3 things going on there. We're going to talk about citation here in more detail. All right, so we're going to pause here for a moment and take a look at the final page of the essay instructions. Just a few reminders as you're writing. Keep in mind this essay will be shared with your classmates for constructive feedback during week 3. So, you know, that's an important thing to remember. Use the examples, skills, and processes you've learned so far this month from the week 1 discussion, the reading, the week 1 and week 2 lectures, obviously everything you've learned so far about paragraph structure, essay structure, and so on. Make sure to carefully document your sources so that all research is used as ethically as possible. This helps convince your readers that you are trustworthy and reliable. In order to document your sources correctly, you must do both of the following. You must have a references list, your last page of your paper, that has all 3 sources on the references page, all the detailed information about your sources, and you must have in-text citations in the body of the essay to identify which sentences contain quotes, paraphrases, and summaries of information from your sources. If you do not have both of these things, it's going to impact your grade pretty heavily. If you do not attempt these things at all, you could end up losing all credit for the assignment. So make sure that you are at least attempting good citation. You also need to write in Microsoft Word. If you don't have Word on your computer, you can access a free online version at Microsoft OneDrive. There's the link. Once you've written your paper on OneDrive, you just download it to your computer so you can upload it to FSO. If you submit your essay in a document format that your instructor cannot open, you will not get credit for it. So submit it in a Word document. And keep in mind also that if you decide not to use Word, even though we have told you to use Word, and you decide to use, say, Google Docs or Pages and then export to Word format, sometimes those exports fail or corrupt the document or corrupt the formatting. And, of course, if you upload something with corrupted formatting, that will also influence your grade. So use Microsoft Word and spare yourself the agony. Just keep that in mind. We really don't like taking points away from students because of these things. That's why we tell you the best tool for the job. All right, so we've talked a lot I've briefly mentioned citing. We're going to talk about this here in more detail here in a couple minutes. I see some questions popping up in the chat. Avia's asking if I did all interviews. I'm guessing if all the research you found was interviews, do I use what the role model said or what the interviewer said? He said, you're going to use what the role model said, which should be in the article. Note that just because an article, there are different styles of writing. A direct interview is going to have like a Q&A format, and you're going to see the questions and the answers. But a lot of articles are written that use interviews as source material, and they are not in that Q&A format. So if you have concerns about how to use something that you think is an interview, talk to your instructor directly about it and show them the source. Marissa's asking, do we copy and paste from Word like our last assignment? No, you're actually going to upload the Word file. You're going to upload the Word file to the page for assignment 2, and you are going to copy and paste the essay to assignment 3. So that's a good question. So for assignment 2, Composing with Care, you are going to upload the Word document here. But you are also going to, on the same day that the essay is due, come over to this discussion board and copy and paste your essay and your references list to a discussion post. You don't need to copy your cover page. Okay. The cover page is really not relevant. The formatting won't translate correctly to a discussion post anyway. Keep in mind that when you paste your essay into the discussion post, FSO is going to mess up some of your formatting. Don't panic about it. I'm not grading your formatting on the discussion board. Okay? That's why you're turning in a Word document version for assignment 2, so I can make sure your formatting's correct. Okay? So we're not going to peer review format on the discussion board. We're not going to worry about format on the discussion board. Just copy and paste the essay. We're going to focus on peer reviewing content. So coming back to the lecture, I said we're going to talk a lot about how to cite properly. So I've got some information there that I need to cover. Yeah, I'm seeing some things kind of flying by in the chat here. Can we please stay focused here? Because we do still have quite a bit to get through, and I'd like to get through it by 5:30 if possible, so this lecture doesn't run long. I know last week we ran a little long. So, all right, where was I? Okay, a couple of resources that you have on the assignment 2 page. Let me just pull that up for you here. Assignment 2. You'll see this whole collection of downloads. This APA Basics goes over APA citation in quite a significant amount of detail. This is going to be extraordinarily helpful to you when it comes time to cite your sources. And of course, this is your assignment instructions. The rubric tells you how the assignment will be graded. This visual guide to the APA document format shows you how to format your document. So we'll take a closer look at both of those here also in the lecture. But I want to get back into talking about citation. So as I mentioned, when you're writing and using other people's ideas, it's important to treat those other creators ethically, to show respect for the hard work that they've done to put those ideas together where you could find them. Giving credit properly makes you seem more credible and trustworthy because it shows that you have respect for other writers. And APA citation is the method that we use in order to give credit. You should already be somewhat familiar with some of the basics of APA citation from the overview video for this week. And if you haven't seen that, you can come back and review that after the lecture. But it's important to know that APA citation is not difficult. It just requires attention to detail. It looks complicated, but we're going to break it down in the session today. And the APA Basics handout also breaks it down to show you that it's really not that hard at all, as long as you are paying attention. The purpose of APA is, of course, to give credit to sources in a logical and globally understood way. And by globally understood, what we mean is that everyone who's familiar with APA citation understands what you're doing when you use APA citation. And because this style is consistent, that means that if you're using this format, anyone can go look up this style if they're not familiar with it and figure out how to find your sources. It's also important to remember that understanding how to cite your sources is going to help you in your future career, because at some point you're going to have to give credit to someone else when you're working on a job or when you're presenting something to your boss. And even getting in the habit of learning how to pay attention to detail, like you will do by practicing APA citation, that habit will be helpful when you have to follow style guides for your industry. And every industry has some sort of style guide for documenting session information, if you're in the recording industry, or documenting progress on a project if you're working in game design or web design. There are many different places where you are going to encounter formats that are specific to those industries or even specific to the companies that you work for. So practicing APA citation, practicing paying attention to detail when you do APA citation helps you strengthen that ability to recognize the details that will enable you to follow the style guides you're going to encounter later in your career. Style sheets, branding guidelines, any type of work documentation, you're going to use this attention to detail skill. It's important. So I'm going to show you some basic examples of a reference page and in-text citations. What's most important to remember when dealing with APA citation is you're not going to memorize these rules. Nobody memorizes the rules for APA citation. Nobody. Ever. I haven't memorized them. What you're going to do is learn the basic steps and learn how to follow examples. And once you know those basic steps and you can find the examples to follow and you follow those examples, you can do APA. Again, attention to detail is really the most important thing that you need when you're doing APA. So each citation has two parts, and I've already mentioned these two parts earlier in the lecture when I was talking about the quote sandwich. You must have both parts in order to give credit correctly and fully to your source. The first part is the references page citation, sometimes called a reference entry. This goes on a separate page at the end of your document. So even if the last paragraph of your essay is at the top of page 4 or whatever, you're going to skip to page 5 before you start your references. They should be all on a page together and it should be the very last page of your document, and it should not have any part of the essay on that page. It's going to include detailed information about your source. All of that source data that you collected last week for each of your sources, this is where that data is going to go. And there's a specific order for that data to go in, which we'll talk about more here in a few minutes. This list of references enables your readers to find those sources and investigate further if they want to. That's the whole point of providing all of that data for those sources, because that data is the information your readers need to find those sources for themselves. A URL or hyperlink is never enough, ever, 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 because that link could change, that source, that page could move or get taken down, and that link would take your readers nowhere, and then you wouldn't be giving any credit at all. So all of that data is required. And you need to remember to include an entry for a source, whether you've copied words from that source or just used ideas or information from that source and put them in your own words. Anytime you use information from a source, you have to include that source on your references page. And when I say information, I mean any kind of information. For this essay, you're not going to include images. If you do, that will negatively impact your grade. But if you had to do an assignment in a future class and include an image in that assignment, that is information, visual information, and your readers would need to know the source of that information. Same thing with podcasts, music, videos. Anytime you use information that was generated by someone else, you have to give credit to the person who created it. So for this assignment, like I said, you're not going to be using images, but you may be using podcasts. If you found a podcast about your role model, you may be using videos. You're not going to include snippets of those podcasts or videos because this is a piece of writing, but you may quote what they said, and those things need to be cited on your references page. So a reference entry breaks down into 4 basic parts. The first part is who. This is the author. And when I say author, I'm using author in the general sense because it may be a person, it may be a group of people, it may be a company that's being credited as the author, or an organization or a government entity, but the author is going to be identified first. The second part is when. This is the publication or copyright date. Author might also be creator if you're dealing with videos. Okay, when is the copyright date? What is the actual source? That would be the title of the article or the title of the podcast or the title of the video or the interview or the book or whatever your source was. Where is where this source can be found? And that's basically all of the additional publishing information that does not fit under the category of who, when, or what. So it may be the location of the publisher that published the book. It may be the name of the magazine that the article was published in, or the name of the newspaper. It may be the location of the web page that the article was published on. That where is probably the most complex and diverse part of any reference entry. It's the part that varies the most. But again, if you know what kind of source you're dealing with, and you can find a professional example of what an entry for that source should look like in an APA manual or in the APA Basics handout for this class, or some other professional APA style guide like projectapa.info, which I'll show you later on in this session. If you can find those examples, then figuring out what goes in this where portion is pretty easy. It really is. So after you have a list of all of your references on your references page, well, we now know what sources you used and we could find them on our own, but we still need to know where in the essay you used these sources. Nicholas has a good question. Does the title always go in italics? If it's a title of a magazine, a newspaper, a scholarly journal, a book, it goes in italics. A movie goes in italics. The title of the article does not. So there's 2 different classifications for titles. One would be a larger work or a full work, which is a complete whole large piece. And then the other is a shorter work or a partial work, which is something that is contained within a larger work. If it is a partial work, it goes in quotation marks, except in the case of a reference entry, in which case we don't bother with the quotation marks because the position in the entry shows us it's the title. If it's the title of a full work, it goes in italics. So that's a good question. All right, so once we have our references list, we still need to show where in the body of the essay this research was used, and that's where our in-text citations come in. They're called in-text citations because they are inside of our text, in the text of the essay. They are super, super short, itty-bitty, teeny, tiny pieces of information because we don't want to interrupt the flow of your writing. We just need to clue readers in that this particular sentence contains research. They go in parentheses immediately after the quotation or in the same sentence as the paraphrased or summarized material. And they mark which ideas, words, etc. came from an outside source. So they help our readers to differentiate between the ideas that we came up with and the ideas that we learned through research. And they align with the reference page citations. And what I mean by align is they're going to contain small snippets of the same information. In this case, those snippets include the last name from who, which applies if the who is a person. If who is an organization, then of course it's going to be the entire name of the organization because organizations don't have a last name, right? You know, the American Medical Association isn't just called association. It's the American Medical Association. So who, and then when, and specifically in this case, just the year. So 2 tiny snippets of information is all that we include in text to signal that this information came from one of the sources in our references list. This is really all the information our readers need to match up the information with the source, because if we know who and we know when, we can scroll right down that references list, find that who right there, make sure that it's the correct when, which is important if you have 2 articles by the same author. Voila, you've made the connection. Okay. So here's a couple of examples of what those in-text citations might look like. This first example is an end-of-sentence citation. An end-of-sentence citation includes both parts of the information, the last name and the year, together in parentheses. It goes before the period at the end of the sentence. Jump back here. For some reason, it skipped ahead a slide. It wasn't supposed to do that. All right. So you'll see that it goes before the period. It has to be inside the sentence. If the period occurs before the citation, that citation is chopped off and it's not getting credit. All right. So make sure that citation is inside the sentence. It should go after the closing quotation marks. Keep in mind that even if your quote ends up here and you have some of your own words after the quote, that citation still goes at the end of the sentence. Okay, end of sentence citation. The second method you can use is what we call an attribution phrase, which is the method similar to the method that we demonstrated in the quote sandwich. In this case, we've identified the source of our quote in the sentence. We've told who this information came from. So we don't need to repeat the source author's name in the parentheses because we already have it here. We've already set it to our readers. We do still need to include the date, though, so we're going to just go ahead and drop that year in parentheses right after we mention the person in our sentence. And then, of course, we have the quote, and since this is a direct quote, we would include the page number. And again, that page number goes at the end. So again, there's plenty of detailed examples of this in that APA Basics booklet that is attached to Assignment 2 instructions. There's also more information at this website, projectapa.info, which is a site that was created by a Full Sail instructor. It has lots of great information about how to cite unusual sources. For instance, if you got some of your information from a podcast, there's information there on how to cite podcasts. You can also refer to Purdue University's online writing lab. If you Google OWL APA, you'll be able to go directly to their APA section on the writing lab. And then the Full Sail Writing Center can also offer feedback on your citations. And If you're really struggling with citations, do the best job you can to follow the examples and instructions in the APA Basics booklet and on projectapa.info to put together the best you can for each source, and then send those reference entries to your instructor and say, hey, did I do these right? And we will happily let you know if you have any errors and what you need to correct. Christopher's also pointing out that the Learn, Smart, Achieve covers APA in some pretty significant detail. So if you do the Learn, Smart, Achieve early this week, you'll have a jump on that APA before you have to turn in your essay. So that's something to refer to as well. And the week 2 reading material has a couple of long pages with very specific detail about APA also, as Rachel's pointing out. So yeah, there's a ton of APA resources for this class. The APA Basics booklet I actually wrote myself. It breaks it down. You really cannot get more simple than the breakdown there. So, you know, I don't want to hear, I don't understand this. I want you to do your best to follow the examples and then contact me or your individual instructor if you have questions, and show us what you've put together and get feedback on, you know, the entries that you've attempted. If we can see what you are understanding, if we can see what you've tried to do, we can help you better than if you just say, I don't get this. Okay? If you don't say, I don't get this, then we're going to explain to you the things we've already explained here because we think we've explained them clearly. So, you know, when you're asking for help, you know, give us something to work with. Taylor's asking, is the deadline for the writing on Sunday? Yes, the deadline for the essay is this coming Sunday. You will have feedback by Thursday at the latest on your discussions. So that pretty much wraps up that portion of the APA. But I did want to show you a little bit of the information in those resources I mentioned to you. As I mentioned, you have this APA Basics booklet that is very detailed, and it breaks down how to basically how to do everything. It talks about why we use APA style if you have questions about that. It talks about when you need to cite, what a reference list is, what the parts are of a reference entry, what the parts are of in-text citations. I know the page says click the items below. If you click, they don't actually jump to pages. I'm still trying to figure out why that's not working. But if you just click through it, you'll see lots of great detail here explaining, you know, what needs to be cited when you paraphrase or quote, when you need an in-text, when you need a reference entry, shows in detail what the parts are, who, when, what, and where, explains what those parts might be and how to handle them. For instance, if you have an unknown creator, well, how do you handle that? There's instructions here that explain that in some pretty significant detail. Let's see. Yes, this APA information that I'm showing you right now, this is one of the downloads for assignment 2. All right, this handout is right there where you can get to it, download it, look it over, read it on your own time, print it out, highlight things, you know, whatever you need to do to get the most out of it. As you're writing, make sure that you take a look at this academic honesty OOPS matrix, which is attached to your professionalism assignment. You should have read it on the first day of class. You'll kind of want to refresh your memory before you turn in your essay. As I've mentioned, if you submit your work without any citations, that is not going to bode well for your grade. What this means is contact us if you are confused or overwhelmed or need help, because we don't like penalizing students. We like helping you understand. Okay? So, you know, if you're feeling like you don't understand it, don't try to take shortcuts. Do your best to follow the examples and then send that to your instructor and say, am I doing this right? And we'll help make sure you're on the right track. Now, the final thing I want to cover uh, in regard to assignment 2 is the document layout. As I mentioned, you have this wonderful example attached to assignment 2. This shows you what your page format should look like. So this is a cover page, and you'll see all this wonderful information that explains how everything should be lined up. It even gives you tips from Microsoft Word on how to create the page headers and so on. Of course, Microsoft Word has an amazing help menu that will explain things in detail as well. And you also have access to Lynda through the Full Sail Library, lynda.com, which has wonderful tutorials on how to use Microsoft Word. So if you can't figure out how to, say, center your text, should actually be pretty easy to figure out because the information's right here. But if you can't figure it out, lynda.com will explain that to you. You'll note that your text has to be double-spaced. The highlights here just sort of help you spot where there's some citation going on in this example, but you should not highlight your own citations. Please don't do that. That's very tough on the eyes when we're reading. And then, of course, as I mentioned previously, at the end of your essay, don't just put your references here. This should be clean. Move to a new page, put your references on the next page. Yes, please do not highlight. The highlights here are to help clarify what is being described in the examples. You should not highlight in your own paper. This is Latin. In case anyone is curious, this example is entirely in Latin because it's not an example of content, it's an example of formatting. And you don't need to understand what the words are saying to understand the visual example of how everything should be laid out on the page. If you do happen to understand some of it, that's great. I'm going to warn you that I have chopped this up and rearranged all of it, so it's not even necessarily complete Latin sentences anymore. So yeah, so this is a visual example of your formatting. And as I mentioned also previously, do not include an abstract. With longer papers, 10 pages or more, in APA style, it's common to include an abstract between the cover page and the first page of your essay. And an abstract is basically a brief summary of what the essay is about. Your papers at 1,400 words are going to top out at approximately 4 pages. Your instructor does not need an abstract to know what those next 4 pages are going to cover. So please do not include an abstract. It's not necessary for this assignment. So the final thing I want to cover is the peer review. Because as I mentioned, that's what's going on next week, and it's important that you know a couple of small details before you turn in your essay, okay? When you turn in your essay for assignment 2, this discussion board will be open on Sunday, all right? You need to come over here after you upload your document to assignment 2. You need to come over here and copy and paste that essay to this discussion board. You must do that by Sunday for full timeliness credit. Your first post for the peer review is graded in part on whether or not you make it on time. And the reason we do that is because in order for a peer review to be effective, everyone needs to get their essays posted early so you all have plenty of time to give each other feedback. The sooner you get your essay posted, the better and the more feedback you're going to receive, and the better that feedback will be. Tuesday of week 3, Tuesday of next week, is the last day that you can get any timeliness credit for posting your essay to the discussion board. If you post it after that, you're going to lose all of the timeliness credit. You'll still get other credit if you do the other necessary things for the discussion, but it's extraordinarily important that you get that essay posted on time. And for maximum timeliness credit, post it on the same day that it's due for assignment 2. In addition to posting your essay, there's one more thing that you need to post. And you'll see on the instructions for assignment 2, there are some self-reflection questions. These self-reflection questions are going to help guide the feedback that you receive during the peer review. They ask specifically which parts of the essay you feel most closely meet the expectations for exemplary writing according to the rubric, and why you feel those parts of your essay are strong, which parts of your essay you feel could use improvement and why you feel they could use improvement. And then you are also being asked to specifically identify 2 parts of your essay that you feel need improvement and ask your peers specific questions about those parts. And an example of a specific question would be, I'm struggling with connecting my research to my own ideas in paragraph 3. I know this transition feels awkward and the summary is very wordy. How can I tighten up the research and introduce it more effectively? This is a specific question that's actually going to help you make your writing better. A non-specific question that will, get you knocked down a few points is something like, do you see any grammar errors I should fix? Because that doesn't really help your classmates give you good feedback, and also probably your classmates feel about as nervous about grammar as you do, and they're not going to give you the best feedback on grammar. In fact, when it comes to peer review, and we'll talk about this more next week, I'm going to specifically request that you avoid talking about your classmates' grammar. Leave that up to the instructors. Okay, so when you post your essay, you also need to post the answers to these self-reflection questions to help guide the peer review. And the idea is that, you want to help your classmates give you the best feedback possible. And by identifying the areas where you feel confident and the areas where you feel like, I could have used some extra help on this, that helps your classmates zero in on places to give you help. Okay? So I want you to answer these questions as honestly and carefully as you can. Yes, these are going to be very long discussion posts when you're done posting them. That's going to be a lot of text. Fortunately, the discussion board does not double-space text. And again, when you post on the discussion board, don't worry about formatting. So at least it will be a little more condensed than it will be in the document. So yeah, so that is the second part of what you need to do to submit your homework, is make sure that you post to the discussion board and answer those self-reflection questions. So does anyone have any questions? He is asking, do we have to cite ourselves for part 1 of this page? I'm not sure what you mean by that, but you are the writer. You don't need to cite yourself. Let's see here. Let's see. Taylor's pointing out that you can collapse posts if you need to scroll through the discussions quickly. Haley says, if we know how to answer number 2, would it still be considered our best first version of the essay if we didn't already include that? I think you're referring to the question, the self-reflection question about where you feel like your essay is not as strong as it could be. Just because you feel like, let me try to explain this from my perspective as a professional writer. There are times when I feel like I've done the best that I can so far and I've hit a wall. And then I turn to my colleagues for feedback. I know I've done the best that I can on this. I still feel like paragraph 4 is not working. Can you see something that I don't see that would make this better? Does that make sense? Even when you feel like you've done the best job that you possibly can, you can still recognize that there are things that are maybe not working as well as you'd like them to work. And by being able to acknowledge that, you give yourself an opportunity to improve. And you give your colleagues and your peers the best opportunity to help you improve. So yes, this needs to be your best possible first version, but you should also acknowledge that even your best possible first version is going to have areas you feel like you still need to work on. And maybe you just don't quite know how to get it where you want it to be yet. Okay? While we're waiting for some more questions to come up here in the chat, I'm going to plug in my laptop because I'm realizing I didn't do that earlier. I'm down to about 30%. Yeah, 29%. Don't want it to turn off before we're done answering student questions. That would be bad. Any other questions? We've only run 8 minutes over so far. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is end the recording for the students who will be watching this later. Those of you who are watching the session later, if you have questions, please do contact your instructors. We'll be happy to answer those questions. Those of you who are in the live session and have questions, you can hang out for a few more minutes and we'll answer those questions for you before we log off.